On a grey Christmas afternoon, a tired young waitress pays for a poor old man's coffee, never knowing he is a lonely billionaire who will soon rewrite the rest of her life. The small diner on the corner buzzed with low chatter and the soft clink of cups, while the rain outside slid down the windows and wrapped everything in a gentle, heavy sadness. Greasy Christmas garlands drooped from the chrome edges of the ceiling, blinking red and gold, as if they were trying a little too hard to be cheerful. Emma thought it would be just another long holiday shift, the kind where time moved as slow as the coffee machine, until she noticed the man in the torn coat sitting alone in the booth by the fogged-up glass. His shoulders were hunched, his hands wrapped tight around the white ceramic cup, as if he were afraid the warmth might run away. When the check landed on his table and he stared at it for a little too long, Emma felt the air around him change, like a quiet storm gathering where no one else was looking. What she did next wasn't about money. It was about dignity, the kind her father once spoke about when he said that nobody should ever be made to feel smaller than a dollar bill. Emma knew she could barely cover her own rent, knew the numbers in her bank account were as thin as the soles of her worn-out shoes, but some lines she simply could not cross. She had no idea that this small choice, made on a grey day the city would forget by morning, would become the moment that turned a lonely billionaire back into a human being and sent her own life down a road she could never have imagined. She walked toward his table with the practiced smile of someone who had learned to hide her worries under a layer of warmth. The old man's coat was frayed at the collar, patched in places that looked like they had lost battles with many winters, and his jeans were ripped at the knees in a way that was not fashionable but simply worn out. He kept his eyes fixed on the steam rising from the cup, pretending to read the small receipt as if its few numbers were written in a language he had forgotten. Emma saw the slight tremor in his fingers and the way his jaw tightened, and she knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been there, that he was counting coins he did not have. Before he could look up and ask for more time or more mercy, she slid her own crumpled bill from the pocket of her apron and placed it over the check, her pulse thudding in her ears louder than the Christmas music on the radio. "Don't worry about it," she murmured, her voice soft enough to hide from the manager, but clear enough for his tired ears. "Someone already covered your coffee today." The old man lifted his gaze slowly, and for a moment the world outside the window with its honking cars and blurred lights seemed to fall away. His eyes were pale and surprised, but there was something sharp buried deep inside them, like a reflection of a life that had once been much bigger than that booth. His mouth opened as if to protest, to insist he would find a way to pay, but the words melted into a rough whisper of thanks that barely reached her. Emma simply nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat, and cleared the small receipt, as if erasing the evidence of his debt could also erase the shame clinging to his shoulders. At the counter, she signed for the payment with trembling fingers, hearing in her mind the voice of Carl, the manager, counting every cent that did not belong to the diner. She told herself it was only a few dollars, told herself she would skip lunch or walk home instead of taking the bus, told herself it was nothing really, even as her stomach twisted at the thought of bills waiting on a chipped kitchen table miles away. When the man stood to leave, he paused at the door and turned back, watching her in a way that made her feel strangely exposed, as if he were measuring more than just her kindness. Emma pretended to rearrange the sugar packets, avoiding his eyes until the bell above the door jingled and the cold air rushed in behind him. Long after he disappeared into the rain, his gaze stayed with her, heavy and uninvited, and she could not shake the feeling that she had just stepped into a story whose ending she did not know. A story that, for better or worse, had already begun to change her life. The bell over the door gave a small, tired ring as the old man slipped out into the rain, and then the diner fell into that strange kind of quiet that doesn't belong a place like that. The Christmas song on the radio kept playing, but the melody felt thin, like it was coming from another room, from another life. Emma stayed there for a moment with her hand still resting on the sugar caddy, listening to the faint echo of his footsteps fading down the sidewalk. She felt the imprint of his gaze on her skin, a weight that had nothing aver with the few dollars she had given up. Behind her, the coffee machine hissed and sputtered, and plates clinked as if nothing important had happened at all, as if the world truly believed that a forgotten old man and a small act of kindness were just background noise. She forced herself to move, to breathe, to slide back into the rhythm of refilling mugs and balancing plates, but her body felt one step out of sync with the rest of the diner. At the register, the receipt for his coffee waited like a tiny accusation. The empty line where the payment should be a hollow little gap on the paper. Emma took her own crumpled bill, smoothed it with trembling fingers, and slipped it into the till, pretending it didn't hurt to watch that last bit of safety vanish into the drawer. She scrawled her initials on the slip, hoping Carl wouldn't look too closely at the handwriting or the way the numbers didn't quite add up. Every time the bell over the door jingled, she flinched, half expecting his heavy steps and impatient voice, half afraid he would never notice at all, and that her sacrifice would dissolve into the grease-stained air without leaving a trace. By the time her shift ended, the sky had darkened from grey to almost black, and the rain outside had turned colder, more determined. Emma tied her coat tight around her thin uniform and stepped into the wet sidewalk, feeling the chill bite through the fabric as if it knew she had skipped her meal. She walked past shop windows filled with glittering decorations and holiday sale signs that belonged to another universe, one where people bought gifts without counting every dollar twice. At the bus stop, she stood under the cracked plastic shelter, watching water streak down the glass, her reflection warped and ghost-like. The image of the old man holding his cup with both hands kept returning, overlapping with memories of her father doing the same at their kitchen table years ago, when money had run low but pride had stayed stubbornly high. The ride home was slow and crowded, full of damp coats and tired faces that seemed washed in the same grey as the sky. Emma clutched her bag against her chest, feeling the stiff corner of the eviction notice pressing through the fabric, like a secret she could not afford to share. Neon signs slipped by outside the bus windows in blurry streaks of red and blue, and in that sliding light she saw the diner, the old man, her own hand placing the bill on the table. She tried to tell herself it had been nothing, that she would make up the difference somehow with another double shift, another skipped meal, another small surrender to exhaustion. Yet beneath the practical thoughts there was a quieter current she couldn't ignore, something like a stubborn conviction that no one should have to choose between paying rent and letting a stranger keep his dignity. When she finally reached the small apartment, the familiar smell of simmering beans and menthol ointment wrapped around her like a worn blanket. Her grandmother sat in the old armchair by the window, a knitted shawl around her shoulders, eyes lighting up the moment Emma stepped inside as if nothing in the world could be more important than that doorway. Emma kissed her forehead and joked about rude customers and cold coffee, carefully skipping over the part where she had lost her lunch money and maybe her good standing with the manager. Later, when the lights were off and her grandmother's breathing settled into a soft, uneven rhythm, Emma lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the rain tapping against the glass. Somewhere between those quiet drops and the murmur of the city below, a doubt settled over her, whether kindness like hers was something the world still made room for, or whether sooner or later it would cost her more than she dared to pay. The alarm went off before dawn, its shrill beeping slicing through the thin walls of the apartment like a reminder that sleep was a luxury, not a right. Emma rolled out of bed carefully so the old mattress wouldn't squeak and wake her grandmother, who finally rested without coughing. In the dim yellow light of the kitchen, she filled the kettle, and watched the water tremble before it boiled, the way her own hands sometimes did after long shifts. The smell of cheap instant coffee rose around her, and for a moment it carried her back to mornings when her parents laughed over the same chipped mugs. Back then, the world felt small but solid, and the future was something bright and simple, not a pile of unopened envelopes waiting on a table. Her father used to say that money could run out, but decency shouldn't, and he proved it by sharing their last slice of bread with neighbors more than once. She remembered him coming home in a grease-stained uniform, smelling of metal and machine oil, still taking the time to ask about her drawings and school stories. Her mother would roll her eyes and pretend to scold him for giving away food, then sneak an extra biscuit into a neighbor's kid's pocket the next day. Those memories floated through Emma's mind like old film reels as she buttered 2 thin pieces of toast, pretending she wasn't counting how many slices were left. She set one plate aside for her grandmother, arranging it with the care of someone serving a feast instead of a bare breakfast. On the small shelf above the sink sat a row of faded photographs, her parents holding her as a baby, her father's arms slung around her mother's shoulders, the 3 of them in front of a rundown car that had once taken them to the beach. There was another picture of Emma at 16, wearing a second-hand dress and holding a volunteer badge from the hospital, her eyes bright with the dream of becoming a nurse. She had imagined white hallways and steady paychecks, not sticky floors and broken jukeboxes in a corner diner. Then her mother's illness had arrived like an unexpected winter, swallowing savings, time and hope in one long, merciless season. When her father's heart failed a year later, the world shrank to hospital bills, funeral costs, and an old woman who suddenly needed Emma more than any dream ever had. By the time the sun pulled a pale strip of light across the window, her grandmother had woken, and Emma helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back. They spoke of small things, the neighbor's noisy television, the way the rain had sounded like applause on the roof, but the real worries sat quietly between them, too heavy to name. After breakfast, Emma kissed her grandmother's forehead and promised that the diner would pick up again, that extra shifts would come, that everything would be fine after the holidays. She said the words gently, smoothing the blanket as if comfort could be tucked in with the fabric. Then she crossed the room to the table where the stack of envelopes waited, standing like pale sentries, guarding the door to reality. She chose the newest one from the bank, the one she had been avoiding since yesterday, and slid a finger under the edge, carefully tearing it open so it wouldn't wake her grandmother's suspicion. The paper inside crackled as she unfolded it, each line of printed text tightening the knot in her stomach a little more. Words like overdue, immediate action, and final notice jumped out at her, sharp as broken glass. Her vision blurred for a second, and she had to grip the back of the chair to steady herself as the message settled in. They were out of time, and the next step would not be a letter, but a knock at the door. Standing there in the soft morning light, with her grandmother humming weakly in the background, Emma realized that the choice waiting ahead of her might be far harsher than anything she had faced at the diner, and that someone, somewhere, already held the power to decide whether her home would survive the winter. Across town, morning light slid through tall windows and spilled across marble floors that had never felt the weight of muddy shoes. Henry Whitmore stood in the foyer of his mansion, shrugging the torn coat from his shoulders while a thin trail of rainwater dripped onto the polished stone. The disguise looked out of place on the brass hook beside tailored cashmere overcoats and neatly pressed suits. He watched a droplet crawl down the frayed sleeve before it fell, leaving nothing behind but a dark spot that would evaporate in minutes. For a moment he envied the drop for knowing exactly where it was going. He walked slowly through the house, passing paintings whose names he had forgotten and sculptures he had never truly liked, each one chosen by decorators who spoke in prices instead of feelings. In the music room, the grand piano waited with its lid closed, a thin coat of dust dimming the shine where his wife's hands once danced. He paused there, resting his fingers on the cool wood, remembering the way she used to fill these rooms with music and laughter until even the servants smiled without realizing it. Since she was gone, the silence had settled over everything like a heavy curtain, muffling every sound except the echo of his own thoughts. Today, those thoughts kept circling back to a young woman in a red apron and the way her hands shook as she laid a crumpled bill on a cheap metal table. In his study, shelves of leather-bound books lined the walls, impressive to visitors but mostly untouched, their spines more familiar to the cleaning staff than to him. Henry lowered himself into the worn leather chair behind the desk, the only piece of furniture that carried the imprint of his body. The city sprawled outside the wide window, grey and wet, its rooftops dipped in mist like ships waiting in some forgotten harbour. He had spent decades buying pieces of that city, offices, warehouses, apartment buildings, turning numbers into more numbers until reports told him he was a billionaire. Yet somehow, the memory that clung to him most stubbornly that morning was not of boardrooms or celebrations, but of a diner booth and a girl who had less than nothing handing over the only certainty she had left. His assistant, Mark, stepped into the doorway with a tablet in hand, listing meetings, investment opportunities, and a lunch with the foundation board that expected another polished speech about corporate generosity. Henry nodded at the appropriate moments, but his mind drifted, comparing the carefully planned donations they boasted about to the unplanned kindness he had received the night before. The foundation gave away millions with press releases and photographs, yet it felt strangely hollow beside that single, secret act of mercy from a stranger who could not afford it. When Mark mentioned that the old diner's building was officially on the market, Henry's gaze sharpened, and he asked, almost casually, for the purchase to be arranged through one of their quieter companies. After the assistant left, Henry opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out an old leather notebook, its pages filled with names and dates from years of his experiments. Each name belonged to someone who had crossed paths with his shabby disguise, some who had kicked him out, some who had ignored him, a few who had helped. He flipped to a fresh page and wrote slowly, Emma, Waitress, Corner Diner, Christmas week. He underlined it twice, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest as the ink dried. He did not yet know exactly what he would do with that name, or how deeply it would thread itself into the fabric of his life, only that he could no longer pretend his visits to the bottom of society were harmless games. Somewhere between the marble floors of his mansion and the cracked tiles of that diner, Henry Whitmore sensed that the balance of power had shifted, and that the girl who bought a stranger's coffee might be the only person capable of showing him what all his money had never been able to buy. The rumors started as whispers carried on the steam rising from the coffee cups. One cook said he'd seen a man in a suit taking pictures of the building. Another swore he'd heard Carl arguing on the phone about numbers that don't make sense anymore. By midweek, every break in the kitchen turned into quiet speculation about new owners, new rules, and who would be the first to lose their job. Emma tried to keep her smile steady as she refilled mugs and balanced plates, but inside, each rumor landed like another stone on a scale already tipping against her. With every passing hour, it became harder to ignore the eviction notice folded in her bag, and the way Carl's eyes lingered a little too long on the register. That afternoon, the diner felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself were waiting for bad news. The decorations on the walls blinked in tired patterns, and the Christmas music now sounded like it was being played underwater. Emma moved through the narrow aisles with practiced grace, dodging chairs and trailing children, but her thoughts kept circling the same anxious questions. If the diner closed, where would she go? Who would hire a waitress with no degree and no savings, dragging along a sick grandmother and a mountain of debt? She caught herself counting the tables, trying to imagine which ones a new owner might keep and where she would be allowed to stand, if she was allowed at all. It was in the middle of that unease that he walked in again. At first, Emma almost didn't recognize him. The torn coat had been mended, his shirt was cleaner, and his hair, though still white and thin, looked as if someone had taken care to comb it. He still moved slowly, shoulders slightly hunched, but there was a quiet steadiness in the way he scanned the room before choosing the same booth by the window. When he sat, he folded his hands on the table, not around an empty cup this time, but as if he were waiting for something more than coffee. Emma felt a faint jolt in her chest, surprised by how relieved she was to see him again. She brought a menu out of habit, even though she suspected he already knew every cheap option printed on it. "Afternoon," she said, offering her usual warm smile, a little more genuine than the ones she saved for difficult customers. He tilted his head, studying her face as if committing every line to memory, then asked quietly for a simple coffee and a slice of apple pie. His voice carried that same soft, educated cadence she had noticed before, the kind that didn't match the frayed edges of his clothes. When another waitress rushed past and accidentally bumped his shoulder, spilling a few drops of coffee onto his sleeve, her annoyed, "Watch where you're sitting, old man," cut through the air like a slap. Before the sting of the words could settle, Emma stepped in with a clean cloth, her apology sincere, her hands gentle as she dabbed the drops from his sleeve. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, giving him the kind of respect the uniform around them did not demand. The old man met her eyes, and for a heartbeat the noise of the diner seemed to fade, leaving only the muted hum of something unspoken between them. There was a question in his gaze, quiet and searching, as if he were measuring not just how she treated him, but who she really was when no one important was watching. Emma didn't know that this moment, small and ordinary on the surface, was his first real test, not of her skills as a waitress, but of the heart that would soon be asked to carry far more than coffee and pie. The next days wrapped around the diner like a rubber band stretched too tight. Carl stalked the floor with a clipboard in hand, counting napkins, sugar packets, and minutes spent at each table as if every second were a personal insult. He snapped at the cooks for using too much cheese, glared at the dishwasher for running the machine half full, and kept a running tally of every supposed mistake. Emma felt his gaze on her back whenever she stopped long enough to listen to a customer's story or offer a tired smile. The place that had once felt noisy and familiar now buzzed with nervous energy, like a room waiting for something to break. On a particularly busy afternoon, the rain had returned, dragging in a stream of soggy, irritable customers. Emma moved quickly between the booths, topping off coffees and balancing plates, trying to stay ahead of Carl's temper. The old man in the mended coat sat quietly in his usual spot by the window, hands folded, watching the storm run down the glass. When Emma passed by, he gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say he saw how hard she was trying to hold everything together. That simple acknowledgement warmed her for a moment, a candle flame against the cold draught of dread blowing through the diner. It didn't take much to set Carl off that day. Emma lingered for a few seconds at the old man's table, making sure his food was warm and asking gently if he needed anything else. She could feel the exhaustion in her bones, but kindness came to her like breathing. Turning it off would have felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite explain. From behind the counter, Carl's voice cracked across the room. "Emma, this is a diner, not a charity. If you've got time to chat, you've got time to turn those tables." A few customers looked up from their meals, some curious, some embarrassed on her behalf, as the color rose in her cheeks. He didn't stop there. Carl marched over, his pen tapping angrily against the clipboard, and pointed toward the old man's half-eaten plate. "You think we're running on smiles and sob stories?" he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're too soft. Customers like him sit for hours and buy nothing, and you encourage it. People like you don't survive in this business, Emma. You want to save the world. Go be a saint somewhere else. Here, you either make money or you're dead weight." The words landed like slaps, each one heavier than the last, and Emma could feel her throat tighten as she swallowed them down. From his booth, the old man sat very still, eyes lowered, but his mind was anything but calm. Henry listened to Carl's tirade, hearing in it an echo of his own voice from years ago, when he had believed that profit was the only measure that mattered. He watched Emma bow her head yet carry on, refilling cups with hands that only shook after she turned away. A quiet war stirred inside him between the hardened businessman who understood Carl's fear and the grieving widower who recognized something rare in Emma's stubborn kindness. As rain drummed harder against the windows, Henry realized he stood at a crossroads of his own making and wondered which voice he would choose to obey the next time Emma's dignity hung in the balance. The official news didn't arrive with drama, just with a plain white envelope, and Carl's tightened jaw as he ripped it open at the counter. For a moment he just stared at the letter, lips moving silently as he read, the color draining from his face. Then he called the staff together with a sharp clap of his hands, the sound cutting through the low murmur of the diner like a knife. Emma wiped her hands on her apron and joined the small circle of anxious faces, her heart already starting to pound. The Christmas lights blinked weakly above them, as if even they could feel something was about to go wrong. Carl cleared his throat and announced that the diner had been sold, the papers signed, the transition happening right after the holidays. His tone tried for calm authority, but the strain twisted every word. He said the new owner wanted efficiency, that some positions would be cut, that they should all show their value in the next days if they wanted to stay. Emma felt the ground tilt a little under her feet, the word efficiency sounding too much like disposable. When Carl's eyes slid over to her and lingered a second too long, she understood that someone had already been weighed and found wanting. The afternoon rush hit harder than usual, a wave of damp customers shaking off umbrellas and bad moods at the door. In his usual booth by the window, the old man, Henry, sat quietly with his coffee, watching everything with that same still, observant gaze. A group of office workers came in, loud and impatient, and one of them recoiled as soon as he saw Henry seated nearby. "I'm not sitting next to that," the man said, loud enough for the room to hear, jerking his thumb toward the worn coat and patched knees. His friends chuckled uneasily, pretending it was a joke, but the disgust in his voice left no room for humor. Emma felt the heat rise in her chest before she even realized she was moving. She stepped between the man and Henry's booth, tray balanced against her hip, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. "Sir, he's a customer just like you," she said, forcing herself to meet the man's eyes. "As long as he has a cup on this table, he has a place here." Uday, the office worker, scoffed and muttered something about cheap diners and stray dogs, demanding another table far away, but Emma didn't move aside. She simply turned to Henry with a small, respectful nod, as if to remind him that in her eyes, at least, he was someone worth standing up for. From behind them, Carl's fury rolled in like a storm. He marched over, face flushed, voice booming through the diner as he accused Emma of driving away paying customers to protect some vagrant who barely orders anything. His words came fast and sharp, about profit, about loyalty, about how he'd warned her that softness was a liability. Then, with everyone watching, he yanked the name tag from her apron and told her she was done, fired on the spot, to clear out immediately. Emma stood frozen for a second, apron limp in her hands, the hum of the diner collapsing into a ringing silence in her ears. At the booth, Henry rose halfway from his seat, caught between worlds, one step from revealing who he really was, one breath from letting her walk into the rain alone. while the question hung in the air like a held note. Would he finally step out of his disguise, or stay a stranger while her life shattered in front of him? The cold hit her first when she stepped outside, a wall of wet air that stole the warmth from her skin in a single breath. Emma clutched the small cardboard box to her chest, the apron and a few personal items rattling inside with every step. The neon sign of the diner flickered behind her, then vanished as the door swung shut, as if the place was swallowing the last proof that she had ever worked there. Rain soaked through her thin coat in minutes, turning her hair into dark ropes that clung to her cheeks. Each car that passed sent a splash of dirty water toward the sidewalk, but she barely flinched, too numb to be angry. She walked without quite knowing where she was going, only that forward felt less terrifying than standing still and thinking. The eviction notice in her bag seemed heavier than the box in her arms, a silent countdown she could no longer pretend not to hear. At a bus stop, she paused under a flimsy awning, watching the streetlights smear across the wet pavement like tired halos. Her reflection in the glass looked older somehow, eyes shadowed, shoulders slumped, as if the word fired had taken more than just her job. For a moment she imagined turning back, storming into the diner, shouting the truth about Carl's cruelty, but the thought died quickly, suffocated by exhaustion. By the time she reached the apartment building, her shoes squelched with every step, and her fingers burned from the cold. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, not sure how much of the wetness was rain and how much was tears she hadn't meant to cry. Upstairs, she paused at the door, forcing her breathing to steady before she turned the key. Her grandmother didn't need to see the storm she carried inside. When she walked in, the familiar smell of rice and herbs greeted her, and the old woman's smile appeared like a candle in the dim room. "Long day?" her grandmother asked, and Emma answered with a practiced half-truth, saying the diner was slow and cutting hours, while her heart shouted the word unemployed. Later, when her grandmother fell asleep in front of the flickering television, Emma sat at the small table with the stack of bills spread out like an accusation. She traced the edges of the envelopes with trembling fingers, doing the math in her head and finding no combination that added up to survival. Her phone screen glowed with job listings that required degrees she didn't have, experience she couldn't fake, time she had already spent trying to keep them afloat. The thought crept in, unwelcome and sharp. Maybe Carl had been right. Maybe softness was just another word for weakness in a world built on profit. She closed her eyes and pressed her palms together, as if she could crush that thought before it took root. Unable to sit still any longer, she slipped on her damp coat again and stepped back into the night, drawn down the block by the dim glow of the small church at the corner. Inside, the air was warmer and smelled faintly of old wood and melted wax. Rows of empty pews stretched out like waiting arms. Emma lit a single candle and knelt, her knees protesting against the worn cushion, her hands folded more out of habit than certainty. She didn't ask for miracles, only for the strength not to grow bitter, not to start seeing every stranger as a threat to her fragile stability. Somewhere across town, in a silent mansion, Henry stared out at the same rain through a pane of flawless glass, haunted by the image of her walking into the storm, and for the first time in years he wondered if all his carefully controlled tests had finally crossed a line his conscience could not afford to ignore. Morning slipped into the apartment wrapped in a dull grey light, the kind that made everything look a little more tired than it already was. Emma sat at the table with a cold cup of coffee, scanning her phone for jobs that all seemed to require certificates she didn't own, and time she didn't have. The numbers in her head refused to cooperate. No matter how she rearranged them, there was always more month than money. Her grandmother shuffled in, leaning on the back of a chair, studying Emma's forced smile with eyes that had seen too many storms. Before either of them could say anything, a firm knock sounded at the door, sharp and unexpected in the quiet. On the other side stood Mrs. Johnson, their neighbour from down the hall, wrapped in a floral housecoat and holding a steaming casserole dish like an offering. "You've been too quiet," she said without preamble, her gaze travelling over Emma's face as if reading a book. She set the dish on the table and announced that her niece's cleaning company was short on people for night shifts in office buildings downtown. It wasn't glamorous, she warned, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was honest work, and it started tonight. Relief and shame wrestled inside Emma as she accepted, grateful for the lifeline, yet painfully aware of how far she'd fallen from her nursing school dreams. That evening, dressed in borrowed black pants and a faded polo with the company logo, Emma climbed into a crowded van with other workers whose names she barely caught. The city looked different from the passenger seat, taller and more distant, its glass towers catching the last scraps of daylight like trophies. They arrived at a building with a lobby so polished the floor reflected the ceiling lights, and for a moment Emma hesitated, feeling out of place among the marble and chrome. Inside, the daytime workers had already vanished, leaving behind empty desks, blinking monitors, and the faint smell of expensive perfume. It struck her how quickly one world slipped away when another clocked in to clean up after it. As the night stretched on, she moved from office to office, wiping fingerprints from glass doors and emptying trash cans full of coffee cups and crumpled plans. From high up behind those windows, the city sprawled below in a restless sea of lights, each glowing square hinting at another life unfolding behind it. Emma paused more than once to press her hand lightly against the glass, wondering what it felt like to belong on the other side, to sit at those desks by day instead of scrubbing them by night. Yet there was a strange calm in the steady rhythm of her work, a sense that at least for a few hours she had something solid to hold on to. Every paycheck would mean one more week, one more month, one more chance not to lose everything. Near the end of her shift, she stepped into a conference room larger than her entire apartment, its long table gleaming under recessed lights. As she wiped down the polished surface, her eyes caught on a brass plaque mounted beside the door. Whitmore Holdings, Executive Boardroom. The name tugged at something in her memory, a faint echo she couldn't quite place at first. Then, like a puzzle piece snapping into place, she remembered the man in the torn coat, the studied way he spoke, the hints of a life that didn't match his appearance. Standing there in the hush of the empty room, mop in hand, Emma felt a ripple run through her, an invisible thread pulling tight between her world and a name she did not yet fully understand, but would soon be unable to ignore. Henry stood at the tall window of his study, watching the city glitter through the veil of rain, each light a tiny reminder of lives he'd touched and lives he'd never see. Emma's figure in the storm, clutching that cardboard box, had followed him into every room since the day she was fired. The old excuses about tests and experiments now tasted bitter, like coffee left too long on the burner. He had money enough to erase mistakes on paper, but not enough to quiet the weight in his chest. At last, he turned from the glass and told his assistant to schedule a Christmas charity gala at the mansion and to request a specific cleaning company for the staff. The preparations unfolded with practiced elegance, florists measuring the staircase, caterers discussing menus, decorators hanging garlands that cost more than some people's rent. Henry moved through it all like a ghost in his own house, nodding when required, but listening for a name instead of a budget. When Mark confirmed that the cleaning company had accepted the job, Henry asked with careful nonchalance for a list of the workers assigned. His heart gave a rare, almost painful thud when he saw her name there, Emma Alvarez, neatly typed among strangers. For once, he did not know whether he was more relieved or afraid. That evening, Emma stood at the edge of the mansion's driveway, staring up at the glowing windows that stacked into the sky like golden promises. She'd been told she would be helping serve drinks at a charity event, a small upgrade from scrubbing floors, and someone had handed her a simple black dress to wear over borrowed shoes. The stone steps felt too clean beneath her feet, the air too perfumed with pine and something expensive she couldn't name. Inside, chandeliers spilled warm light over polished marble, and a string quartet played softly, their music floating like silk through the halls. Emma took a deep breath, lifted the tray they gave her, and stepped into a world that had never been meant for her. She moved carefully among the guests, offering glasses that cost more than her entire week's pay to people who barely looked at her face. Laughter echoed off the high ceilings, smooth and practiced, as men in tailored suits and women in jewel-bright dresses spoke of investments, holidays, and distant trips. Emma's eyes slid over their polished shoes and glittering jewelry, remembering the weight of her grandmother's worn slippers and the stack of bills waiting back home. Yet beneath her quiet awe, there was a thin thread of calm. Work was work, she told herself, whether in a greasy diner or a shining palace. As long as she kept moving, kept serving, the numbers in her head might still bend enough to keep them afloat. Then, as she passed the music room, the world narrowed to a single point. Near the grand piano stood a man in a dark, perfectly cut suit, his white hair neatly combed, his posture straight, but somehow tired at the edges. For a heartbeat, Emma saw only the elegance, the silver watch, the polished shoes, the confident way people called him Mr. Whitmore. But then he turned slightly, and the light caught his face in a familiar angle. The same eyes that had once peered over a chipped coffee cup, the same lines carved by winters spent in a torn coat. The tray in her hands trembled as recognition hit her like a sudden gust. In that suspended moment, with music swelling softly behind them and rain tapping the tall windows, Emma understood that the poor old man from the diner had never been just another customer, and that fate, with quiet insistence, had brought their two worlds back together under the same roof. For several minutes after spotting him, Emma moved through the glittering crowd as if she were walking underwater, every sound muffled, every light too bright. The tray in her hands felt heavier than it should, her grip tightening each time someone said, "Mr. Whitmore," within earshot. She kept stealing glances toward the piano, half afraid she had imagined the resemblance, half hoping she had. But every time he turned, she saw the same tired kindness at the corners of his eyes, the same way his shoulders curved as though used to carrying more than their share. The poor old man and the billionaire host were not two different people. They were one truth she did not know how to hold. Henry noticed her long before their eyes properly met. He watched the way her smile slipped for a heartbeat when she recognized him, the way she steadied herself and kept working anyway. Guilt rose in his throat like something physical, thicker than any speech he had given to shareholders or donors. Between conversations, his gaze followed her through the ballroom, tracing the invisible line that stretched from a greasy diner booth to the polished floor beneath her aching feet. At last, unable to stand the distance any longer, he leaned toward his assistant and quietly requested that the young woman in the black dress be sent to his study with the next round of drinks. When Emma was told to bring a tray to Mr. Whitmore's private room, her heart stumbled, then tried to race its way out of her chest. The hallway to the study was quieter than the rest of the house, lined with oil paintings and soft lamps that threw warm pools of light onto the carpet. Each step sounded too loud in her ears, as if the walls themselves were listening. She paused at the heavy wooden door, balancing the tray on one hand, while the other hovered over the handle, wondering not just what waited behind it, but who. With a careful breath, she pushed it open and stepped into a room that felt less like a billionaire's office and more like a museum of one man's remembered life. Books lined the shelves from floor to ceiling, their spines worn in a way the art in the hallways had never been. On the desk sat framed photographs, a younger Henry laughing beside a woman at a small diner counter, a family gathered on a lawn, a piano covered in sheet music and birthday balloons. He stood by the window, no longer surrounded by admirers, just a solitary figure in an expensive suit that suddenly seemed like any other layer of costume. When he turned to face her, there was no performance in his eyes, only something raw and unguarded, the look of a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Emma set the tray down with more care than necessary, her fingers brushing the polished wood, as if it might anchor her in this unlikely reality. "Emma," he said softly, using her name as though it mattered more than all his titles, and the sound of it in that room made the air feel different. He thanked her first, not just for the coffee, but for the way she had stood between him and humiliation, for the simple humanity she had offered when he looked like no one worth noticing. The words tumbled out slower than he intended as he confessed his habit of disguising himself, his grief, his selfish curiosity about who still had a heart in a world obsessed with money. Each sentence brought a flush of anger and understanding to Emma's face, her hands curling at her sides as she listened. Then Henry drew a quiet breath as if about to step off a ledge, and told her that what he wanted now was not another test, but to make her an offer, one that could erase her debts, transform the diner, and change the direction of her entire life, if she could find it in herself to trust the man who had hurt her without ever meaning to. For a long moment after he spoke of his offer, the room held its breath, but Emma did not. Something inside her snapped into sharp, trembling focus, cutting through the haze of chandeliers and charity banners. "An offer," she repeated, the words tasting strange on her tongue, like a foreign dish she wasn't sure she could swallow. Her hands, still red from cleaning solutions and long nights, curled into fists at her sides. The photographs on his desk, smiling faces, bright lawns, birthday balloons, seemed to watch her as she stepped closer, carrying with her every unpaid bill and every humiliation he had never seen. "Do you know what happened after you walked out of that diner?" she asked, her voice low but edged with something that made Henry's shoulders stiffen. She didn't wait for an answer. The story spilled out of her in tight, controlled bursts, Carl's shouting, the name tag torn from her chest, the cardboard box of cheap belongings pressed into her arms. She told him how the rain had soaked through her uniform as she walked home trying not to cry, how she had lied to her grandmother because the truth would have broken the old woman's fragile peace. Every word landed in the quiet room like a small stone dropped into deep water, ripples of consequence spreading long after his experiment had ended for the day. Henry listened without interrupting, feeling each detail sink into him with a weight he could not shrug off. He had always imagined his disguises as harmless, uncomfortable for him perhaps, but revealing, informative, even noble in some twisted way. Now, hearing Emma describe the real cost of his curiosity, the idea curdled. He saw with painful clarity that her life did not pause when he left the diner. His tests had not evaporated just because he'd taken off the coat. "I never meant," he began, then stopped, realizing how small and cowardly that sounded in the face of what she had endured. Intent suddenly felt like a poor shield against the damage he had allowed. Softening, Emma spoke of the long nights that followed, the job lost, the eviction hovering like a shadow at the door, the quiet panic of staring at bills that would not shrink no matter how hard she prayed. She described scrubbing the offices of people who would never know her name, looking down at a city she could not afford to live in, and then finding his name, Whitmore, engraved on a plaque. "I was cleaning your boardroom," she said, voice cracking for the first time, "while wondering if you even remembered the girl who paid for your coffee." The confession hung between them, fragile and raw, as if she'd laid her entire pride on the desk beside his polished pen. Henry moved around the desk, no longer wanting it as a barrier between them. He spoke then not as a billionaire or a host, but as a widower who had once lost the only person who made his wealth feel like anything more than numbers. He confessed how, after his wife died, he had hidden in roles and masks, trying to feel something real in the way the world treated a man who seemed to have nothing. He admitted that he had turned people's reactions into data, stories into notes in a leather book, never fully allowing himself to see the human cost beneath the ink. Standing there in the warm lamplight, her in borrowed shoes, him in an expensive suit that suddenly felt too tight, they looked at each other across the canyon of class and grief and pride. Neither of them knew yet if a bridge could be built over such a distance, or if some gaps in trust were simply too wide for even the bravest heart to cross. The next day, a black car that looked completely out of place on their cracked street stopped in front of Emma's building. Neighbors peeked through curtains as the driver stepped out, hat in hand, and politely asked for Miss Emma Alvarez. Her grandmother's eyes widened, flickering with both fear and excitement, as an invitation printed on heavy cream paper was placed into Emma's trembling hands. The card bore Henry Whitmore's name and the address of the mansion she had cleaned in borrowed shoes. For a heartbeat, the tiny kitchen felt too small to hold the future that had just been slipped across the table. Emma wanted to refuse, to stay where everything was familiar, even if it hurt. But her grandmother gently touched her arm. "Sometimes, mija, God sends the answer in clothes we don't recognize," the old woman whispered, seeing more than Emma had said. So Emma dressed in her best blouse, smoothing the wrinkles as if they were doubts she could iron flat. The ride to the mansion felt unreal, each passing block pulling her further from the world of shared casseroles and overdue bills. When the car doors opened onto the long stone steps, she saw Henry waiting outside, not as a distant host, but as a man who had chosen to stand in the cold and greet her himself. Inside, he led them not to the grand ballroom, but to a smaller sitting room filled with warm light and the faint smell of coffee. There were no reporters, no foundation board, no one to applaud what he was about to do. It was just a tired billionaire, a young woman, and the grandmother who had taught her how to survive with grace. Henry spoke slowly, his hands clasped in front of him, as he admitted again how wrong he had been to treat real lives like lessons. Then he told them that he had bought the diner outright, not to shut it down, but to rebuild it as a place where no one would be shamed for being poor. Every word landed softly, like snow on a roof, but underneath, something vast was shifting. He laid out his offer with the careful clarity of a contract and the trembling hope of a confession. Emma would be the new manager, he said, with a salary that could wipe out her debts and keep a roof over their heads without fear. In time, she would become a partner, sharing in the profits of a business built on dignity instead of humiliation. On top of that, his foundation would cover her nursing studies, part-time at first, so she could finally pursue the dream she had buried under shifts and bills. "This is not charity," Henry insisted, voice thick. "It's an investment in the kind of heart I forgot the world still had." For a moment, Emma could not speak. Her throat tightened, and the room blurred at the edges as tears pressed hot against her eyes. She thought of every late night, every cold walk home, every time she had chosen kindness even when it cost her. Her grandmother's hand found hers, fingers squeezing with a strength that seemed to say, "Take it. You've earned it." When Henry reached into a small box and placed a new name tag in her palm, Emma Alvarez, manager, the metal felt heavier than any tray she had ever carried. As she closed her fingers around it, she felt not just rescued, but entrusted, and a quiet question rose in her chest. How would she carry this new power without losing the humble, stubborn kindness that had brought her to this impossible, beautiful turning point? The months that followed did not arrive with fireworks, but with quiet, steady changes that felt almost like healing. The cracked walls of the diner were painted in soft, welcoming colors. The old booths were repaired instead of replaced, as if the place itself were being given a second chance. Warm light pooled from new bulbs in the same familiar fixtures, turning chipped mugs and simple plates into something almost cozy. The smell of burned grease gave way to the scent of real soup simmering and pies baking slowly in the oven. Behind the counter, where she had once stood afraid of every shift, Emma now took her place as manager, her new name tag shining gently against her apron. She rehired the cook who had always slipped extra fries to crying children, and the dishwasher Carl used to bark at, this time with fair wages and hours that didn't break their backs. Then she opened the door to others no one else wanted to trust. Men and women with gaps in their resumes, shaky references, or records that made most employers look away. In their first staff meeting, Emma didn't talk about profit margins. She talked about dignity, second chances, and the rule that no one truly hungry would leave without eating. They listened because she did not preach from a distance. She spoke as someone who had lived on the edge of no and been pulled back. Slowly, the diner began to feel less like a business and more like a small, stubborn refuge. Henry became part of the refuge too, folding himself into its daily rhythm with a humility that surprised even him. Some days he arrived in a well-tailored suit, fresh from meetings in glass towers. Other days he walked in wearing the old repaired coat, the one that had first carried him to Emma's booth. Either way, she greeted him with the same teasing warmth, sliding a mug of coffee across the counter and reminding him that no house accounts meant even billionaires had to tip. Customers grew used to seeing him carry plates, wipe tables, and kneel to pick up dropped napkins, his wealth invisible unless you knew where to look. In the clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversation, the loneliness that once echoed in his mansion began to soften into something like belonging. The first of his children arrived on a weekday afternoon, as the light slanted gold through the windows and the after-school rush had not yet begun. His daughter stepped in with cautious eyes and careful clothes, pretending she'd found the diner by accident, though her gaze lingered on Henry with too much history for coincidence. She ordered a coffee she barely touched, asking small questions about the menu, while her real questions hovered unspoken between them. A week later, his son came with 2 children in tow, the little ones pressing their noses to the dessert case and laughing when Henry struggled to choose between cupcakes, as if it were the hardest decision in the world. Awkward visits turned into tentative routines. One more lunch, one more shared joke, one more thread stitched through fabric that had once been torn. One evening, after closing time, Emma counted the register while Henry dried dishes beside her, their movements comfortably in sync. The diner was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerators and the whisper of rain beginning outside. When his phone buzzed on the counter, he glanced at the screen and something in his face shifted, the old fear and longing rising together like a tide. The message was from his son, asking if this year the whole family could spend Christmas together at the diner. Like a real family, if you still want that. Henry read the words twice, then a third time, as if afraid they might vanish. Emma watched him wrestle with the answer, knowing that the next choice he made would not involve stock or property or numbers on a page, but the braver decision of whether to open his heart fully to the people who had once walked away, and to let this little diner become the place where all of their broken pieces might finally begin to fit. Christmas returned to the city, wrapped in the same grey rain as the year before. But this time the little corner diner refused to look tired. Warm light spilled through the fogged windows, turning each drop of water into a tiny jewel as it slid down the glass. Inside, the clink of cups and low murmur of conversation rose and fell in a gentle rhythm, as comforting as an old carol hummed under the breath. The walls held new photographs now, of regulars laughing, kids with crooked smiles, and a framed image of the old diner beside the renewed one, quiet proof that even cracked things could be made beautiful again. Emma moved between the tables with a sure, steady grace, her name tag catching the glow as if it had always belonged right there over her heart. At the corner table near the window, in the very booth where he had once hidden behind a torn coat, Henry sat surrounded not by silence, but by family. His son and daughter shared the bench opposite him, their own children squeezed between them with plates of fries and crumbs of pie, decorating their holiday clothes. The conversation began carefully, circling around safe topics: school plays, work projects, vacation plans, each word tiptoeing over years of distance and misunderstanding. Yet every now and then, a memory from before slipped out, and no one pushed it away. They let it sit between them like an old photograph, fragile but worth holding. As Henry watched his granddaughter lean lazily against his arm and saw his son laugh at a joke he might once have dismissed, he felt something inside his chest loosen, as if a door, long rusted shut, had finally creaked open. From behind the counter, Emma drank in the scene with a quiet, grateful heart, seeing more than just customers at table 7. She noticed the way Henry's gaze softened whenever his children looked at him without anger, and how his fingers trembled slightly when he reached for their hands, and they did not pull away. Between refilling coffee cups and carrying plates, she slipped a generous meal to a man in a damp jacket who hovered near the door, asking for nothing but a little warmth. "No rush," she told him softly as she set the food down, the words carrying the weight of all the times she had wished someone had said the same to her. In that moment, she understood that the diner was no longer simply where she worked. It was the living echo of a decision she had once made with a single crumpled bill and a heart that refused to stop caring. Later in the evening, when the rush had settled into a comfortable lull and the youngest children were beginning to doze against their parents' shoulders, Henry rose slowly from his seat. He held not a crystal glass, but his familiar white coffee mug, the same kind Emma placed in front of every other soul who walked through the door. Clearing his throat, he thanked his children for coming, his voice rough around the edges as he admitted how often he had hidden behind money, pride, and even costumes because he was afraid they might see the lonely man beneath it all. Then he turned to Emma, saying her name with a reverence usually reserved for blessings, and told everyone that a long time ago, when he looked like he had nothing, she had given him the one thing he could not buy: unseen kindness. The room fell into a soft, full silence, not the empty kind, but the kind that arrives when everyone present understands that something wounded has just begun to heal. When the doors finally closed for the night, and the last goodbyes drifted away into the misty air, Emma stepped outside for a moment, letting the cool drizzle kiss her face. Behind her, through the glowing windows, she could still see Henry wiping a table, while his grandchildren stacked napkins into crooked towers, a picture of a life that almost never was. She thought of the girl she had been on that first rainy Christmas, scared and broke and still unable to leave a stranger in humiliation, and felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with money or titles. There would still be hard days ahead, unpaid bills, unexpected losses, people who walked in carrying more sorrow than they could say. But now there was also this small, stubborn refuge where dignity was served with every cup. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.